Love isn't loud. It doesn't always arrive with fireworks or perfect timing. Sometimes love shows up as confusion, patience, loss, and growth all at once. What most people don't tell you is this: love isn't something you fall into blindly. It's something you learn, often the hard way. You learn it when your heart breaks, but you don't become bitter. You learn it when you choose respect over control, understanding over ego, and courage over fear. Today isn't about fairy tales or easy promises. It's about understanding what love really asks of you, how it challenges you, humbles you, and quietly shapes the person you become. If you've ever loved deeply, lost painfully, or wondered why love feels so complicated, this is where your understanding begins. Love begins long before another person enters your life. That's something most people don't want to hear, because it removes the fantasy that someone else will arrive and fix what feels broken inside. Love doesn't start with finding the right person. It starts with knowing yourself well enough to understand what you're offering and what you're asking for. Without that awareness, love turns into hunger, and hunger is not the same thing as care. Hunger takes, love chooses. When you don't know yourself, you confuse attachment with connection, and you mistake attention for intimacy. You think love is about being needed when in reality, love is about being present without losing who you are. A lot of pain comes from expecting another human being to complete a story they didn't start. People enter relationships carrying unspoken wounds, unresolved fears, and silent expectations. They hope love will erase those things, but love doesn't erase anything. It reveals. It brings your strengths and your shadows into the same room. If you haven't looked at yourself honestly, love will force you to, not as punishment, but as truth. And truth can feel uncomfortable when you've spent years avoiding it. Self-awareness isn't about self-criticism. It's about responsibility. It's about knowing when your reactions come from fear instead of reality, when your silence comes from pride instead of peace, and when your anger is really unspoken sadness asking to be heard. When you know yourself, you stop using love as a place to hide. You don't need to control another person to feel secure. You don't demand constant reassurance to feel worthy. You don't confuse intensity with depth. You understand that real love is quiet sometimes. It breathes. It listens. It doesn't rush to fill every silence. Self-aware love doesn't panic when things slow down. It understands that growth has seasons, and not every moment needs fireworks to be meaningful. This kind of love isn't built on fantasy. It's built on reality, and reality is strong enough to last. Possession often disguises itself as devotion. People say they love deeply when what they really mean is they're afraid to lose. Fear creates rules. It creates conditions. It turns love into a contract instead of a choice. When you don't know yourself, you look for ownership because ownership feels like safety. But no one thrives in a cage, even a golden one. Love that tries to possess will eventually suffocate the very thing it wants to protect. Self-awareness teaches you that another person is not an extension of your identity. They are a whole world walking beside you, not behind you. Knowing yourself also means understanding your capacity to love without keeping score. When you're unaware, you measure love in sacrifices and expect repayment. You remember every time you gave more, every time you stayed quiet, every time you compromised. That kind of love becomes heavy. It keeps records. It builds resentment slowly, quietly, until one day it spills out in ways that surprise even you. Self-aware love gives freely, not because it expects something back, but because it understands its own limits. It knows when to give and when to rest. It knows when to speak and when to step back. There's a difference between wanting someone and needing someone. Want is healthy. Need can become dangerous when it replaces self-worth. When you know who you are, love becomes a shared journey instead of a rescue mission. You don't ask someone to save you from loneliness or emptiness. You invite them to walk with you while you continue becoming who you are. This is where love becomes partnership instead of dependency. Two people choosing each other daily, not because they're afraid to be alone, but because together feels honest. Self-awareness also teaches you how to love without losing your voice. Many people think love means disappearing into another person's needs. They shrink their opinions, silence their boundaries, and convince themselves that endurance equals loyalty. But love that requires self-erasure isn't love, it's survival. When you know yourself, you understand that boundaries are not walls. They are doors that show people how to enter your life with respect. Love grows stronger when both people feel safe, enough to be real, not perfect. Understanding yourself means recognizing patterns. You start to see why you're drawn to certain types of people, why familiar pain feels comfortable, why chaos can feel like passion when calm feels unfamiliar. Love doesn't heal those patterns by itself. Awareness does. When you become conscious of what you repeat, you gain the power to choose differently. You stop confusing emotional intensity with connection. You stop chasing what hurts you just because it feels familiar. Love becomes a place of healing, not reenactment. Self-awareness brings humility into love. You stop pretending you have all the answers. You learn how to apologize without defending your mistakes. You learn how to listen without preparing a response. Love deepens when ego steps aside. When you know yourself, you're not threatened by being wrong. You're not afraid of growth. You understand that love is not about winning arguments, but understanding perspectives. It's not about proving strength, but practicing kindness even when it's inconvenient. Another thing people misunderstand is that self-love is not selfishness. Knowing yourself doesn't mean choosing yourself at the expense of others. It means choosing honesty over performance. It means you don't promise what you can't sustain. You don't give love in ways that exhaust you and then blame the other person for it. You offer love in ways that align with who you are, not who you think you should be. This kind of love is stable. It doesn't burn bright and disappear. It stays. Love that begins with self-awareness is resilient. It doesn't collapse at the first sign of conflict. It understands that disagreement doesn't equal disconnection. When you know yourself, you don't abandon love the moment it becomes uncomfortable. You also don't stay when it becomes harmful. You can tell the difference. That clarity is powerful. It protects both hearts involved. It allows love to exist without fear, without manipulation, without silent suffering. You start to understand that love is not about fixing each other. It's about witnessing each other, supporting growth without forcing change, accepting imperfections without ignoring harm. When you know yourself, you stop projecting your unmet needs onto another person. You communicate instead of assuming. You ask instead of accusing. Love becomes a conversation instead of a battlefield. There's also courage in self-aware love. The courage to be seen fully, to admit fears without turning them into weapons, to say this is who I am without apology and without arrogance. Vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the strongest foundation love can stand on. When you know yourself, vulnerability doesn't feel like exposure. It feels like truth. And truth builds trust, slowly, quietly, honestly. Self-awareness changes how you handle loss and distance. You don't chase love that's leaving. You don't beg for effort that's not being offered. You understand that love cannot be forced into staying. When someone chooses to walk away, you let them go without destroying yourself in the process, not because it doesn't hurt, but because you know your worth isn't defined by someone else's ability to stay. That understanding doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. Love that starts with self-awareness is patient. It doesn't rush commitment out of fear. It doesn't confuse chemistry, compatibility. It allows time to reveal character. You pay attention to how someone treats others, how they handle stress, how they show up when things aren't easy. You understand that consistency matters more than intensity. This kind of love builds slowly, but it builds something real. You also learn that loving yourself doesn't mean isolating yourself. It means choosing connection without desperation. You open your heart without abandoning your center. You allow love to enhance your life, not consume it. When two self-aware people love each other, there's space to breathe. there's room for individuality. Love doesn't feel like a constant test. It feels like home, not because it's perfect, but because it's honest. When love begins with self-awareness, it becomes a choice you make every day. Not a feeling you chase, not a role you play, not a sacrifice you endure. A choice to show up, to listen, to grow, to stay present even when it's uncomfortable. A choice rooted in understanding rather than illusion, in clarity rather than fear, in respect rather than possession. And when love is built on that foundation, it doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply exists, steady, grounded, alive, continuing to unfold, teaching you more about yourself with every shared moment, every silence, every breath, every step forward into what love really is, without ever pretending that it is something you own, something you control, or something that ends when understanding is still unfolding. Love demands patience more than passion. Passion is loud. It announces itself quickly. It feels powerful because it moves fast and burns bright. Patience is quiet. It doesn't rush to be seen or validated. It waits. And most people confuse the two because passion is easier to feel than patience is to practice. Passion gives instant emotion. Patience asks for endurance, understanding, and restraint. Love that lasts is rarely built on how intense it feels in the beginning. It's built on how steady it remains when intensity fades and reality takes its place. In the early moments, love feels effortless. Words come easily, time disappears, everything feels aligned. But love doesn't reveal its true nature in moments of excitement. It reveals itself in pauses, delays, misunderstandings, and waiting. Patience is what shows up when messages aren't returned quickly, when moods change without explanation, when life interrupts plans, and when people don't always show up as the best version of themselves. Without patience, love becomes fragile. It breaks under the weight of unmet expectations. Many relationships fail not because love disappears, but because patience runs out. People expect love to always feel the way it did at the start. When it doesn't, they assume something is wrong. They chase the feeling instead of nurturing the bond. But love isn't meant to stay in its first form forever. It evolves, it deepens, it slows down so it can grow roots. Patience is what allows that growth to happen without forcing it. Patience in love means understanding that another person is not a project with a deadline. Growth doesn't happen on command. Healing doesn't follow a schedule. Push for answers, labels, and certainty before trust has time to develop. They mistake urgency for seriousness. But love built in a hurry often collapses under pressure. Patience allows love to unfold naturally. It allows two people to learn each other's rhythms, boundaries, and communication styles without fear. When patience is missing, love becomes demanding. It wants constant reassurance, immediate replies, perfect behavior. It interprets delays as rejection and silence as abandonment. Patience replaces these fears with understanding. It trusts without controlling. It gives space without withdrawing. It allows independence without feeling threatened. This balance is where love matures from emotional dependence into emotional security. Patience doesn't mean ignoring problems. It means addressing them at the right time, in the right way. Some conversations need distance before clarity. Some wounds need time before healing. Patience understands timing. It doesn't force resolution when emotions are raw. It waits until both hearts are calm enough to listen instead of defend. Love grows stronger when problems are handled with care instead of urgency. There is also patience in learning how someone loves. Not everyone expresses love the same way. Some people show love through actions instead of words. Some through consistency instead of intensity. Without patience, these differences feel like absence. With patience, they become understanding. Love deepens when you stop demanding love to look a certain way and start recognizing it in the ways it's being offered. Patience allows love to survive seasons of distance. Life doesn't pause for relationships. Responsibilities grow. Rest accumulates. Energy shifts. Passion may quiet during these seasons, but patience keeps love connected. It understands that closeness is not always physical or constant. Sometimes it's loyalty in absence, trust in uncertainty, and presence in intention rather than proximity. Love without patience becomes transactional. It gives only when it receives. It stays only when it benefits. Patience removes conditions. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't threaten to leave at every conflict. It creates emotional safety, and safety is what allows people to be honest instead of perfect. Love flourishes where patience makes room for truth. Patience also teaches you when to wait and when to walk away. This is often misunderstood. Patience is not staying forever. It's staying long enough to know whether love is growing or fading. It listens to patterns, not promises. It observes behavior over time. It doesn't cling to potential while ignoring reality. Patience brings clarity, not blindness. When you practice patience in love, you stop trying to control outcomes. You understand that love is not something you manage. It's something you participate in. You show up, you communicate, you care, and then you allow things to unfold. This removes the pressure to perform and replaces it with authenticity. Love becomes less about proving and more about being. Patience slows love down so it can become meaningful. Fast love is exciting, but slow love is deep. It notices details. It remembers small things. It builds shared history. Patience allows moments to matter. It turns ordinary days into connection. It understands that love isn't made in grand gestures alone, but in consistency, reliability, and quiet presence. There is strength in patient love. It doesn't crumble at uncertainty. It doesn't chase validation. It doesn't need constant confirmation to exist. It trusts the bond it's building. This trust creates stability, and stability allows love to last beyond emotion, beyond circumstance, beyond time. When love is guided by patience, it becomes less about how it feels and more about how it endures. It understands that feelings change, but values remain. Passion may start the journey, but patience is what carries it forward day after day through silence and laughter, distance and closeness, questions and understanding, shaping love into something steady, intentional, and real as it continues to grow without rushing toward an ending or pretending that love is meant to be easy instead of meaningful. Love survives through respect, not control. Control often hides behind the language of care. It says it's protecting, guiding, or helping, but underneath it's driven by fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of losing importance, fear of not being enough. Respect, on the other hand, doesn't need to hold tightly to feel secure. It trusts, it allows space, it understands that love is not about ownership, but about choice. When control enters love, freedom quietly leaves, and without freedom, love begins to shrink. Many people confuse control with commitment. They believe checking, questioning, monitoring, and correcting are signs of deep involvement, but love doesn't require surveillance to survive. When respect is present, trust becomes natural. You don't need constant proof of loyalty. You don't demand access to every thought, message, or moment. Respect understands that privacy is not secrecy and independence is not betrayal. Love grows stronger when both people are allowed to exist fully, not when one person dictates the rules of the other's life. Control tries to shape another person into something easier to manage. It pushes preferences, expectations, and conditions onto them. Over time, the controlled person begins to feel smaller. They start editing themselves to avoid conflict. They hide parts of who they are to keep peace. This isn't harmony, it's quiet surrender. Respect doesn't ask someone to disappear, it makes room for difference. It understands that two people can love each other deeply without thinking the same way, wanting the same things, or moving at the same pace. Respect listens without interrupting. Control listens only to respond. When disagreements arise, control focuses on winning. Respect focuses on understanding. Love doesn't survive on victories, it survives on being heard. When someone feels respected, they don't need to defend themselves constantly. They feel safe enough to be honest. And honesty is where intimacy lives. Without respect, conversations become battles and love becomes exhausting. There is also respect in accepting boundaries. Control sees boundaries as threats. It pushes against them, questions them, and tries to weaken them. Respect sees boundaries as clarity. It understands that limits are not rejection, but protection. Love becomes healthier when boundaries are honored, not negotiated into silence. Respect allows both people to maintain their sense of self without guilt. Control often grows louder during insecurity. When fear appears, control tightens its grip. It demands reassurance, compliance, and certainty. Respect responds differently. It communicates vulnerability instead of enforcing rules. It says, I'm afraid instead of you must change. Difference matters. Love can handle fear when it's spoken honestly. It struggles when fear turns into dominance. Respect also means acknowledging another person's autonomy. Their choices, opinions, and paths belong to them. Love is not permission to decide someone's life. Control believes love earns authority. Respect knows love earns trust. When two people respect each other's autonomy, love feels like support, not supervision. Each person grows, not just in the relationship, but as an individual. When respect is missing, love becomes conditional. Approval replaces affection. Acceptance depends on behavior. Slowly, love turns into performance. The need to be right becomes more important than being kind. Control creates an environment where mistakes feel dangerous. Respect creates an environment where mistakes become opportunities for understanding instead of punishment. Respect also shows in how conflict is handled. Control uses silence, guilt, or anger to regain power. Respect uses communication to restore balance. It doesn't weaponize emotions. It doesn't threaten abandonment to gain compliance. Love survives conflict when both people feel valued even when they disagree. Respect keeps love from turning into a test of endurance. Another overlooked aspect of respect is consistency. Control can be intense but unstable. It reacts based on mood and insecurity. Respect is steady. It doesn't fluctuate with emotion. It treats love as a commitment to fairness, not a tool for dominance. This consistency builds trust. Control often demands change without self-reflection. Respect begins with self-awareness. It asks, why does this bother me? Before asking someone else to adjust. This inward reflection prevents love from becoming a place of projection. Respect understands that not every discomfort needs correction. Some need understanding, some need patience, some need acceptance. Love that survives through respect feels lighter. There is less fear, less tension, less need to prove worth. Both people can breathe. They don't walk on eggshells. They don't rehearse conversations out of fear of reaction. Love becomes a safe space instead of a controlled environment. Respect also means letting go when control would rather hold on. When love no longer aligns, respect doesn't trap someone in guilt. It allows honest endings without cruelty. Control clings to power even when love has faded. Respect values truth over possession. This doesn't mean love stops hurting. It means it ends without destroying dignity. When respect leads love, both people feel seen instead of managed. They feel chosen, not monitored. Love becomes mutual effort, not enforced behavior. This balance allows love to grow without fear. It allows affection to exist without obligation. It allows connection to deepen without pressure. Love survives through respect because respect keeps love human. It recognizes flaws without exploiting them. It allows closeness without ownership. It builds connection without control. When respect is present, love doesn't need rules to stay alive. It stays because it wants to, because it's nurtured by understanding, trust, and freedom, unfolding naturally as two people continue choosing each other without needing to dominate, restrict, or reshape one another to feel secure. Love grows when fear is faced, not avoided. Fear is always present in love, even when people pretend it isn't. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of being seen too clearly, fear of not being enough. Many people believe love should erase fear, but love doesn't remove fear, it exposes it. And what you do with that fear determines whether love grows or collapses under its weight. Avoiding fear feels safer in the moment, but over time, avoidance creates distance. Facing fear creates depth. When fear is ignored, it turns into silence, conversations are postponed, feelings are buried, needs go unspoken. People convince themselves they are protecting the relationship by not saying what hurts, but silence doesn't protect love, it slowly erodes it. Love needs honesty to survive, and honesty requires courage. Facing fear means speaking even when your voice shakes, trusting that truth is safer than pretending everything is fine. Fear also shows up as withdrawal. When something feels uncomfortable, people pull back emotionally instead of leaning in. They become distant, distracted, unavailable. This isn't because they don't care, it's because they're afraid of what closeness might demand. Love grows when you notice this instinct to retreat and choose connection instead, not aggressively, not desperately, but intentionally. There is fear in vulnerability. Letting someone see your insecurities feels like handing them power. Many people protect themselves by wearing masks, presenting strength, or pretending indifference. But love can't connect with a performance. It connects with what's real. Facing fear means allowing yourself to be seen without guarantees. It means trusting that even if you're not perfectly understood, honesty is still worth the risk. Fear often disguises itself as anger. When people feel threatened, they react instead of reflect. They argue, accuse, or criticize, not because they want conflict, but because fear doesn't know how to ask for reassurance. Love grows when you recognize the fear beneath the reaction, when you choose to understand instead of escalate, when you respond to insecurity with patience rather than punishment. Another common fear in love is abandonment. This fear makes people cling, control, or constantly seek reassurance. It turns love into anxiety. Facing this fear doesn't mean demanding certainty from another person. It means building security within yourself. It means understanding that love is a choice, not a guarantee. When you accept that someone stays because they want to, not because they're trapped, love becomes more meaningful. Fear of loss also makes people hold back their love. They ration affection, believing it will hurt less if things end. But love withheld is love already wounded. Facing fear means loving fully even when the outcome is uncertain. It means accepting that love's value is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how honestly it's given. There is fear in growth. As people change, love must adapt. This can feel destabilizing. Familiar patterns break, roles shift, comfort zones dissolve. Avoiding this fear leads to stagnation. Love grows when both people allow change without seeing it as a threat. When growth is welcomed instead of resisted, love evolves rather than expires. Fear also prevents difficult conversations. People avoid talking about boundaries, expectations, and future plans because they're afraid of answers they might not like. But uncertainty doesn't disappear by avoiding it. It grows. Facing fear means choosing clarity over comfort. It means asking questions even when you're not ready for the answers, trusting that truth is kinder than confusion. Facing fear in love also means confronting your own flaws. It means acknowledging jealousy, insecurity, and past wounds without projecting them onto another person. This self-confrontation is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Love grows when responsibility replaces blame, when you own your fear instead of letting it control your behavior. There is also fear in letting go of control. Control feels like protection, but it's actually fear trying to manage outcomes. Love grows when you release the need to control and accept uncertainty. When you allow love to exist without guarantees, this doesn't weaken love, it strengthens it by making it real instead of conditional. Fear of being alone keeps many people in relationships that no longer nourish them. Facing fear means choosing honesty over attachment. It means understanding that loneliness within love is more painful than solitude outside of it. Love grows when it's chosen freely, not when it's clung to out of fear. When fear is faced, communication deepens, trust strengthens, intimacy becomes safer. Love transforms from something fragile into something resilient. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to dictate behavior. Love becomes a space where fear can be expressed without shame. Facing fear also allows forgiveness. Holding on to fear keeps wounds open. Addressing it allows healing. Love grows when people are willing to acknowledge hurt, take responsibility, and move forward without keeping score. This doesn't erase pain, it gives it meaning. Love that grows through facing fear is not perfect or fearless, it's honest. It understands that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stay present despite it. When fear is no longer avoided, love becomes deeper, steadier, and more authentic, unfolding through honesty, vulnerability, and trust as two people continue to meet fear together instead of running from it or allowing it to quietly shape their choices from the shadows.